somewhere in a loft in Birmingham, or a garage in Leeds, there is a box nobody has opened since the 1980s. Inside it, a chipped die-cast car, a doll with matted hair, a plastic hopper with the color worn off one side. You had one of these, maybe several, and then one Christmas they were simply gone from the shelves. Not banned in some dramatic headline, not recalled with a public apology, just quietly removed, replaced, forgotten, while a new generation grew up never knowing they existed at all. This is the story of 25 British toys from the 1970s that vanished before anyone realized they were gone. And it is not really a story about toys. It is a story about factories that closed, companies that collapsed into each other, and a country that, without quite noticing, stopped making its own childhood. Let us start with something almost every British child bounced on at least once. In 1971, thousands of children woke up on Christmas morning to find a large, strange, orange rubber ball waiting at the foot of the bed. The space hopper. You gripped the little horns on its head, sat down hard, and bounced across the garden until your arms ached. For a few years it was everywhere, on every street, in every school playground during break time. Then it faded, slowly, into the background of childhood, until entire families forgot they ever owned one. Around the same years another playground craze arrived, and this one did not fade quietly. It was banned. Clackers, sometimes called clackers, were two hard acrylic balls on a string that children swung together to make a sharp, satisfying clacking sound. Children competed to see who could clack the fastest, the loudest, the longest. But the balls were hard enough to shatter, and shards of acrylic sent more than one child to hospital with cuts near their eyes. Quietly, without much fanfare, shops stopped stocking them. Parents were relieved, children were furious, and an entire toy simply disappeared from British playgrounds within a couple of years of its peak. If you want to understand why so many of these toys vanished, you need to understand the ground they were standing on, because it was already cracking. Before we go further, if you had one of these toys as a child, do something for me. Subscribe to this channel now so you keep getting stories like this one, and drop a comment telling me which toy from this video was yours. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories, and it means a lot to see your memories in the comments. If you are enjoying this, give the video a like, and share it with a friend who grew up in the same decade. Now let us keep going, because the next part of this story gets a lot more personal, and a lot more painful for the people who made these toys in the first place. By the middle of the 1970s, the world of British doll making had a new star, and her name was Pippa. Made by Palitoy between 1972 and 1980, Pippa was a small, 6.5-inch fashion doll, pocket-sized, easy to collect, with an entire circle of friends, an apartment, a car, and even her own hair salon set. For a generation of girls, Pippa was not just a doll, she was a whole miniature world you could carry in a coat pocket. One woman remembered playing with Pippa and her friend for hours, though she could no longer recall all their names, only that she had loved the little cardboard house that came with them. And then as the decade turned, Pippa was quietly discontinued, her molds retired, her friends forgotten, while larger, flashier dolls from overseas took over the toy aisles instead. Palitoy did not stop at Pippa. Under the same roof, the company also produced Tressie, a doll whose great trick was hair that could be made to grow longer at the press of a button hidden in her back, then wound back in with a small key. For a few Christmases, that single mechanical trick made Tressie one of the most requested toys in the country. Then the novelty faded, the manufacturing rights shifted, and Tressie slipped quietly out of production, remembered now mostly by the women who once wound that little key as girls. And there was Girls' World, the disembodied head on a plastic stand that let children practice hairstyling, curling, plaiting, and makeup on a face that never complained. It sat on dressing tables across Britain through the decade. A strange and slightly eerie object by today's standards, but a genuine bestseller in its time. Even the doll that seemed unstoppable was not immune to reinvention that erased what came before. Cindy, launched by the British company Pedigree in September of 1963, had been the nation's answer to Barbie, sold with the slogan, "The doll you love to dress." Through the 1970s, she kept reinventing herself to survive. These were toys made by real companies, employing real people in real British factories. And to understand why so many of them disappeared completely, rather than simply being redesigned, you have to follow the money. Because underneath the toy aisle, an entire industry was quietly falling apart. Lang. It starts with a name that once meant more to British toys than almost any other. Lines Brothers, the parent company behind Triang, at one point the largest toy manufacturer in the world. In 1971, Lines Brothers collapsed. The empire that had built prams, dolls, houses, and toy vehicles for decades came apart. The empire that had built prams, dolls, houses, and toy vehicles for decades came apart, and its most valuable remaining assets, Meccano and Dinky Toys, were picked up by another British company entirely, the model kit maker Airfix. For a while it looked like a rescue. Dinky, under new ownership, struck licensing deals with television producer Jerry Anderson, turning his puppet shows into die-cast gold. Lady Penelope's pink Fab 1 car arrived in 1966, Thunderbird 2 followed in 1967, and by the early 1970s, the Interceptor and Shadow Mobile from the series UFO were among the best-selling toys Dinky had ever produced. Children who watched these shows on Saturday mornings could hold the vehicles in their hands that same week. It felt, briefly, like Dinky had found its second wind. If your childhood involved even one of these die-cast cars, or a Jerry Anderson toy sitting on a shelf, let me know in the comments which one it was. And if this kind of deep, factual British nostalgia is something you want more of, subscribing costs nothing and means everything to a channel like this one. Licensing deals could not fix what was happening underneath the factory floor. Meccano itself, the company behind the construction sets that had taught generations of British children about engineering, began to buckle under financial pressure as the decade wore on. Workers facing the loss of their jobs occupied the factory in protest, refusing to leave. Airfix, the company that had swallowed both Meccano and Dinky in an attempt to diversify beyond its plastic model kits, found itself carrying a weight it could not sustain. Competition from Matchbox, from Corgi, and increasingly from manufacturers overseas where labor was far cheaper, squeezed profit margins until there was almost nothing left. Dinky's later models, produced under Airfix's ownership, grew steadily worse. Garish colors, poor detailing, cheap vacuum-formed plastic packaging that tore before it even reached the shelf. In a last, almost desperate attempt to cut costs, some models were even outsourced to Hong Kong for manufacture. Something Dinky had quietly tried once before with limited success. It was not enough. In 1979, Airfix sold off the Liverpool factories that had produced Meccano and Dinky toys since the early 20th century. The famous Binns Roadworks, a Liverpool landmark since 1914, fell silent that November, closing its doors for the final time and ending Dinky's life as a true British-made brand. Airfix itself did not survive much longer. In January of 1981, the company that had defined model making for an entire nation went into receivership. Its most valuable remaining pieces, the model kit business itself, were bought by the American food giant General Mills through its British toy subsidiary Palitoy, the very same company behind Pippa and Tressie. To really understand why so many British toy companies collapsed in such a short space of time, it helps to step back from the toy box for a moment and look at the country around it. The 1970s in Britain were not an easy decade for any manufacturer. The 1973 oil crisis sent the cost of oil rocketing worldwide. And oil was not just fuel, it was the raw material behind the plastic that nearly every modern toy was made from. Overnight, the cost of producing a simple plastic figure or a molded doll's head climbed sharply, squeezing the profit margins of companies that were already competing against cheaper labor abroad. Long then came the three-day week at the start of 1974, when industrial disputes and an energy shortage forced factories across the country, toy factories included, to operate on strict electricity rationing, running machinery for only 3 days out of every 7. Add to that inflation that peaked at close to 24% in 1975. A currency crisis severe enough that Britain had to borrow from the International Monetary Fund in 1976, and repeated waves of industrial strikes. And you begin to see why so many household toy names, companies that had survived 2 world wars, could not survive one difficult decade of British economic history. It was not that children stopped wanting these toys. It was that the factories making them were fighting battles far bigger than anything happening in a toy chest. Palitoy itself, the company behind so many of the toys already mentioned in this video, tells that story in miniature. Founded in 1919 by Alfred Pallet in Colville, originally under the name Castleloyd, the company had been making toys and dolls in the English Midlands since the 1920s. It survived being bought by British Xylonite in 1931, survived the Second World War, and by 1968 had become valuable enough to be bought outright by the American food giant General Mills. Through the 1970s, under American ownership, but still largely built on British soil, Palitoy absorbed struggling rivals rather than being absorbed itself, buying the Chad Valley toy brand in 1978, and later picking up the pieces of both Airfix and Meccano after their own collapses. It looked for a while like a survivor, but the same forces working against every other British toy company eventually caught up with Palitoy too, and by 1994, after a string of further ownership changes, the name Palitoy disappeared from British toy packaging for good, folded quietly into the American company Hasbro. Dinky was not the only British die-cast name fighting for survival in these years. Corgi Toys, made by a company called Met Toy, had spent the 1960s and 70s as Dinky's fiercest rival, famous for opening bonnets, working steering, and a James Bond Aston Martin with an ejector seat that became one of the best-selling toy cars in British history. Yet Corgi and its parent company faced exactly the same pressures as Dinky, the same rising costs, the same competition from cheaper overseas manufacturing, and by the early 1980s, Met Toy itself collapsed into receivership, and Matchbox, made by a London company called Lesney Products, once the single largest toy exporter in Britain, suffered an almost identical fate, falling into receivership in the early 1980s after decades as a genuine national success story. 3 of Britain's great die-cast toy names, Dinky, Corgi, and Matchbox, companies that had once made pocket-sized cars for children all over the world, collapsed within a few short years of one another for almost exactly the same reasons. Not every disappearance came from a boardroom collapse. Some came from something much smaller and much stranger, a shift in taste that nobody planned and nobody controlled. Long take the toy soldiers made by Britons, a name that had been shaping British toy chests since the Victorian era. Through the 1960s, the company had produced its Herald Miniatures range in Hong Kong, small plastic figures in bright, simple colors that filled countless toy boxes. Long, in 1971, Britons began phasing that range out, replacing it gradually with a new line called Detail, molded in a different plastic, using plug-in arms that allowed poses the old figures never could. By 1976, Herald Miniatures were gone entirely, and an entire generation of children grew up never knowing their parents had played with different soldiers altogether, holding a completely different toy under the exact same brand name. Safety regulation played its own quiet role in this story of disappearance. As injuries from toys like clackers made headlines, and as public pressure grew for tighter standards, the British Standards Institution published its first dedicated toy safety standard, known as BS 5665, formally setting out rules for how toys sold in Britain had to be designed and tested. It was a necessary and overdue step forward for children's safety. But it also meant that certain toys, built under looser, older assumptions about what was acceptable to sell to a child, simply could not be brought up to the new standard cheaply enough to survive, and were quietly withdrawn rather than redesigned. Around the tea table and the fireside, a different kind of extinction was happening. This time among games rather than dolls or die-cast cars. Buckaroo, the game where players stacked plastic saddlebags, hats and pans onto a spring-loaded mule until it inevitably kicked everything flying, was a fixture of British living rooms through the decade. Operation, with its buzzing metal tweezers and its patient nagging to remove the funny bone without touching the sides, taught an entire generation the particular dread of a loud electric buzz. And as the decade drew toward its close, a new kind of game arrived that needed no board and no pieces at all, a memory game of colored lights and electronic tones. Children called it Simon, and for a Christmas or two, it was the single most wanted object in the country. Each of these had its season at the very top of every child's list, and each was eventually pushed aside by something newer, smaller, cheaper to produce, or simply more fashionable, until the specific version that filled British homes in the 1970s was no longer the one still sitting on shop shelves. And then there were the toys that never had a chance to fade slowly at all, the ones that arrived with enormous fanfare and then vanished almost overnight. One toy, remembered by the trade press at the time as a flop to rank alongside the yo-yo and the hula hoop, promised to be the next great playground craze, and simply was not. It sold briefly, disappointed retailers who had ordered it in bulk, and vanished from shelves within a single season, a reminder that not every toy company failure in this story was slow and industrial. Some failures were fast, sudden, and brutally simple. A product nobody actually wanted, discovered the hard way, at enormous cost by the people who had bet a Christmas on it. Smaller, gentler toys had their own quieter departures too. Play-Doh's barbershop playset, letting children snip and style pretend hair from plastic heads with genuine child-sized scissors, was a favorite for a season before newer Play-Doh sets replaced it entirely. Matchbox brought out its power track racing sets, motorized toy cars racing round plastic circuits, competing directly against Scale Extric for space under the Christmas tree, only for the format to be replaced within a few years by newer racing systems. And branded toys built around Mr. Men, the simple, brightly colored characters that had taken over British children's books and television, filled toy shelves for a period before licensing moved on to other properties entirely, taking an entire wave of Mr. Men merchandise quietly out of production with it. One curious arrival in that same electronic wave was Stop Boris, an electronic creeping spider that children had to freeze in place using a special toy gun, part of a wider boom in electronic games and radio-controlled toys that defined the second half of the decade. It had its moment, its season of being the thing every child wanted, and then it was replaced by something newer, faster, more advanced, the way electronic toys always are. Board games fared rather differently. Monopoly celebrated its 40th anniversary in 1975, and Waddington's own Cluedo turned to 25 that same year, both still selling briskly, both still on shelves today. It is worth remembering the contrast, because it shows that the toys on this list did not vanish simply because children stopped loving them. Most of them vanished because of what was happening behind the scenes, far away from any child's bedroom, in factories and boardrooms the children themselves never saw. American imports added another kind of pressure entirely. Stretch Armstrong, a rubber-bodied figure that could be pulled and twisted into strange shapes, arrived from across the Atlantic and became an instant obsession, one that British-made stretchy toys could never quite compete with. Evel Knievel's stunt cycle, a wind-up motorcycle that let children recreate the American Daredevil's jumps across the living room carpet, captured imaginations the same way. And when the television series about a bionic astronaut became a hit, action figures built around that same idea flew off shelves faster than British toy makers could design a response. Each of these was a small sign of a larger shift, British children's shelves increasingly filled with toys designed and profited from somewhere else. German competition told a similar story. Play People, the small figures made by the German company Playmobil, invented in the early 1970s by a designer named Hans Beck, whose simple faces were based on a child's drawing, arrived in British toy shops and won a Toy of the Year award, small, chunky, and endlessly reconfigurable. They were affordable and easy to manufacture at scale, exactly the kind of European efficiency that struggling British companies like Meccano and Airfix simply could not match. British toy makers were not standing still though. Britain's itself produced a detailed model farm combine harvester that won its own Toy of the Year award, proof that British manufacturing still had craft and imagination left in it, even as the industry around it was crumbling. Not every disappearance in this story came from Britain's own struggling companies. Some came from a British toy losing a fight it never really had a chance of winning. Long the Spanish company Exin launched Tente, a plastic building brick system built to rival Lego piece for piece. British shop shelves briefly carried both systems side by side. But Lego's head start, its scale, and its enormous back catalogue of sets meant that Tente, despite genuine engineering ingenuity, never carved out more than a small foothold in the United Kingdom, and gradually receded from British shelves as Lego's dominance became total. Some disappearances were gentler, closer to simply growing up and out of a toy rather than losing it to a factory closure. The Raleigh Chopper, with its high-rise handlebars and long banana seat, borrowed from the American Schwinn Stingray, had stormed the British youth bike market at the start of the decade and reportedly helped save Raleigh from financial disaster. But questions about its safety followed it through the decade, and when the 1980s brought the sleeker, lighter BMX craze in from America, the Chopper's era ended almost overnight, its distinctive silhouette replaced in bike sheds up and down the country. The Raleigh Grifter, launched in 1976 with its chunky frame and twist grip gears, became a defining bicycle for a slightly younger crowd. While the very smallest children bounced instead on Weebles, the egg-shaped figures famous for wobbling but never quite falling down. And in quiet corners of many British homes sat a spirograph set, gears and wheels that traced endless colored patterns onto paper. A toy actually invented by a British engineer and first sold in the 1960s. Through the 1970s it was manufactured and exported under a series of different owners, its ownership and its packaging changing so many times that its original British identity gradually faded from public memory, even while the toy itself somehow remained on shelves for years to come. Which brings us to the moment that captures everything this video has been building toward. November of 1979, Liverpool. The Binns Road factory, a place that had built Meccano sets and dinky toys since before the First World War, closed its gates for the very last time. No fanfare, no national mourning, just workers collecting their final wages, machinery falling silent, and a piece of British manufacturing history quietly switching off its lights. For decades, that factory had put real, tangible toys into real children's hands. Toys built by British workers, in a British city, for British families. When it closed, it did not just end a company. It ended a way of making childhood itself. If you grew up with any of these 25 toys, you were living through the final years of a British toy industry that made its own things, in its own factories, before global competition, corporate takeovers, and cheaper overseas labor quietly took that away. None of these toys vanished because children stopped loving them. They vanished because the ground underneath them gave way, piece by piece, factory by factory, until there was nothing left to stand on. So here is what I will leave you with. Somewhere in a box you have not opened in years, there may still be a piece of that story. A small plastic figure, a die-cast car with the paint worn thin, a doll whose hair someone once wound in and out with a tiny key. It is easy to think of these as just toys. They are not. They are the last physical proof that Britain once made these things itself, before it stopped. If this video brought back a memory you had forgotten you still carried, tell me about it in the comments below. Subscribe if you want more of these stories told properly, with real history and real respect for the people who lived it. Like this video if it meant something to you, and share it with someone who remembers exactly what I have been talking about. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.